Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into a question that has lingered gently at the edges of human curiosity for thousands of years. Could it be that the stories our ancestors told of flying chariots, sky beings, and journeys beyond the heavens were not just imagination, but something more? But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a joy to see all the places we gather from, each in our own little slice of time. Now, feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's gently begin our journey into this quiet mystery together. And if your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Let it drift. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. Tonight, we won't rush to conclusions. We won't try to prove anything too quickly. Instead, we'll do something much softer. We'll simply listen to ancient stories whispered across continents, to modern sightings that still defy easy explanation, and to the slow, careful language of science which, in its own way, is still trying to catch up with the strangeness of the universe. And somewhere between these layers, myth, memory and measurement, we may begin to notice something curious, a pattern, a quiet thread that seems to stretch across time itself. So get comfortable, let your breathing slow, and let's begin gently with the stories we thought we already understood. If you were to travel back in time, far beyond cities, beyond written history, into the early rhythms of human life, you would find something surprisingly familiar. People telling stories, not just simple tales to pass the time, but vivid accounts of things that felt larger than life. Stories of beings who descended from the sky, of luminous objects moving silently overhead, of journeys beyond the clouds where time itself seemed to behave in unusual ways. At first, these stories might feel like pure imagination. After all, every culture has its myths, and myths, we're often told, are just symbolic, creative ways of explaining a world that once seemed mysterious and unpredictable. But if you listen a little more closely, something begins to shift. Because these stories, though separated by oceans and centuries, begin to echo one another in quiet, unexpected ways. In ancient India, texts describe vehicles called vimanas, craft that move through the sky, sometimes with great speed, sometimes hovering gently, as if untouched by the pull that keeps everything else grounded. In parts of the Middle East, there are tales of flying carpets, soft, silent platforms that could carry a person across vast distances in what felt like no time at all. In Greek mythology, the gods are often depicted arriving in shining chariots that descend from above. In the Hebrew Bible, a prophet describes a vision of wheels within wheels, spinning and glowing, accompanied by a presence so overwhelming that it brings him to his knees. And in ancient Mesoamerican cultures, there are carvings and figures that seem to show humans seated within enclosed structures, sometimes surrounded by shapes that resemble motion or even flight. Now, none of this proves anything on its own, and it's important to say that gently. Stories are not evidence in the scientific sense. They shift, they evolve, they carry symbolism, emotion, and imagination. Over time, they become layered, like sediment building up over centuries of retelling. But still, there is something quietly intriguing about the repetition. The same kinds of images, the same sense of something descending from above, The same feeling that for a brief moment the ordinary rules of the world no longer applied. And perhaps even more interesting is how these stories are told. Because when ancient people described what they saw, or what they believed they saw, they didn't have the language we use today. They didn't have words like aircraft or propulsion or gravity. They didn't speak in terms of engines or materials or energy, systems. Instead, they reached for what they knew. If something moved through the sky, they might describe it as a chariot, because that was the fastest vehicle they understood. If it glided silently, they might compare it to a bird or a floating carpet or even a living creature. Imagine for a moment trying to describe a modern airplane to someone who has never seen metal, never heard the sound of engines, and has no concept of flight as we understand it today. You might say it is like a bird, but made of something harder than stone. You might describe its wings, but struggle to explain why they do not flap. You might speak of people sitting inside it, travelling across the sky, faster than any horse could run, and even then, your description would only capture a small part of what it truly is, not because you are wrong, but because your language is limited. And this is where the stories begin to feel different. Because what if these ancient accounts were not entirely invented? What if instead they were attempts, imperfect, human, deeply sincere attempts to describe something real, something unfamiliar, something just beyond the edge of understanding? Not magic exactly, but not fully explainable either. A kind of experience that sits somewhere between the known and the unknown. When we look at these stories through that lens, they begin to take on a softer, more curious shape. They are no longer just myths to be dismissed, nor are they proof of anything extraordinary. Instead, they become something in between. They become records of perception, moments where human beings encountered something they did not yet have the tools to understand, and so they translated it gently, creatively, into the language of their time, a language of gods and chariots, of flying creatures and divine journeys, of heavens above and worlds beyond. And perhaps the most interesting part is not what these stories claim, but how similar they feel, even when told by people who never met, never shared ideas, and lived in entirely different parts of the world. It's like hearing the same melody played on different instruments, each version slightly different, each shaped by its culture, its beliefs, its imagination. But underneath it all, something familiar, something consistent. And as we begin to move forward, slowly and gently, we won't try to force these stories into a single explanation. We won't rush to say they must be true or must be false. Instead, we'll hold on to that quiet question. What if these were not just stories but reflections, not of what people knew, but of what they were trying, in their own way, to understand? And if that's the case, then the next step becomes even more interesting. Because if ancient stories were shaped by limited language, what might we see if we look at them again, this time with the language we have now? As we continue our quiet journey, let's imagine something simple. You're standing beneath an open sky, no cities, no electric lights, no satellites drifting silently above, just darkness, stretching endlessly, filled with stars that feel almost close enough to touch. For most of human history, this was the sky people knew, a sky that was constant, predictable. The same constellations rising and setting, night after night, like a slow, reliable rhythm. The moon changing its shape in a familiar cycle, the sun returning each morning without fail. And because of this consistency, anything unusual stood out immediately. A light that moved differently, an object that changed direction, something that appeared, hovered, and then vanished. These were not small details. They were moments that interrupted the expected order of the world. And when something interrupts the expected, it tends to stay in memory. There is a story, often mentioned in ancient writings, about the time of Alexander the Great, over 2,000 years ago. As his army prepared to move deeper into unfamiliar lands, something appeared in the sky. Descriptions vary, as they often do with stories passed down through time. But many accounts speak of shining objects, sometimes described as discs, that moved above the battlefield. They didn't behave like birds, they didn't drift like clouds. Instead, they seemed to move with intention, at times descending rapidly, then pulling away again, almost as if they were observing, or even interacting. What's particularly striking is not just the description, but the reaction. The animals, especially the war elephants, became agitated, startled. They broke formation, disrupting the entire army. And eventually, according to some versions of the story, this strange encounter contributed to a decision to turn back. Now, whether every detail of this account is perfectly accurate is not the point. What matters is something quieter, that this story was remembered, that it was written down, that it became part of a larger pattern of moments where the sky behaved strangely. And this is not the only example. Across different regions and time periods, there are records, sometimes brief, sometimes poetic, of lights in the sky that did not move like stars or planets or anything familiar. In ancient Rome, historians described glowing shapes that appeared in the heavens, sometimes during times of conflict, sometimes without any clear reason at all. In medieval Europe, there are reports of luminous spheres drifting silently above towns, occasionally changing direction in ways that seemed almost deliberate. In East Asian records, there are accounts of objects that glowed like embers, moving slowly across the sky before fading into darkness. Each description is shaped by its culture. Each uses its own language, its own imagery. But beneath those differences, there is something quietly consistent: the movement. Because what people seem to notice, again and again, is not just that something appeared, but how it moved. It didn't fall like a stone. It didn't arc like a thrown object. It didn't follow the steady path of a star. Instead, it changed direction. It paused. It accelerated. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. Today we might describe such motion using more precise language. We might talk about speed, acceleration, direction. We might measure how quickly something moves from one point to another. But for ancient observers, those concepts weren't framed in numbers. They were framed in feeling. Something that moved faster than anything they had seen. Something that turned in ways that made no sense. Something that felt different. And perhaps that's the most important detail. Because when something behaves differently from everything else you know, your mind searches for a way to understand it. Not with equations, not with instruments, but with comparison. You compare it to a bird, but it doesn't flap its wings. You compare it to a chariot, but it doesn't touch the ground. You compare it to fire, but it doesn't fade or flicker in the same way. And slowly, you begin to describe it using the closest ideas available to you. Not because they are perfect, but because they are the only tools you have. And this is where something subtle begins to emerge. Because if we place these stories side by side, not to prove anything, but simply to observe, we start to see a pattern not just in appearance, but in behaviour. Objects that move with unusual smoothness, change direction without slowing, appear and disappear without warning. Now, today, when people describe certain unidentified objects in the sky, the language is different. We talk about instant turns, or extreme speeds, or movement that doesn't seem to follow the usual rules. But interestingly, the feeling behind those descriptions is very similar to the ones found in ancient accounts. A sense of confusion, a sense of awe. and often a quiet realization that whatever was seen did not quite fit within the known world. Of course, there are many possible explanations for such observations. Natural phenomena can be surprising. Light can bend and scatter in unexpected ways. Atmospheric conditions can create illusions that feel almost otherworldly. And sometimes, what we think we see is shaped by expectation, memory, or even emotion. But even with all of that in mind, the pattern remains, not as proof, not as certainty, but as a quiet thread running through history. Moments when people looked up and saw something they could not easily explain. And perhaps what makes these moments so enduring is not just what was seen, but how they made people feel. A mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. A sense that the sky, which had always felt so familiar, might still hold something unexpected. Something just beyond reach. And as we move forward, this becomes an important shift. Because instead of asking, were these objects real in the way we understand reality today, we might ask something gentler. What did these people experience? What did they try to describe? And how did those descriptions evolve as human understanding slowly expanded? Because the next step in our journey is not just about what appeared in the sky, but how human beings tried to make sense of it, how they translated the unfamiliar into something meaningful, and how, in doing so, they may have left behind traces, not of certainty, but of curiosity, traces that we are still, quietly, trying to understand. There is a quiet moment that happens whenever we encounter something unfamiliar. It is not dramatic, not loud. It doesn't arrive with certainty or clarity. Instead, it feels like a pause, a small hesitation in the mind as it searches for something, anything, that can make sense of what it is seeing. And in that moment, something very human begins to unfold. We translate, not in the sense of converting one language into another, but in a deeper, more instinctive way. We take something unknown and we reshape it into something familiar. We soften its edges. We wrap it in concepts we already understand. And in doing so, we make it feel manageable. Imagine for a moment trying to explain something completely modern, something like a smartphone, to a person living thousands of years ago. You might say it is a kind of stone that glows with light. You might describe how it can carry voices across great distances, as if people were speaking from inside it. You might even say it contains moving images, like tiny living scenes captured behind glass. But none of these descriptions would be entirely accurate. They would be approximations, translations. Because without the shared language of circuits, signals, or digital systems, you would be left with metaphor. And metaphor, while beautiful, is never precise. Now let's gently bring that idea back to the ancient world. When early humans looked up and saw something they could not explain, something moving differently, behaving in ways that felt unfamiliar, they would have faced the same challenge. How do you describe something that doesn't fit into your world? You don't describe it directly. You describe what it reminds you of. And this is where many ancient stories begin to take on a new kind of meaning. Take, for example, an artifact discovered in Central America. It appears to show a figure seated inside what has been interpreted as the shell of a turtle. But when you look more closely, the form feels unusual. The body is positioned in a way that suggests enclosure. The limbs are drawn inward, almost as if they are tucked inside a confined space. And the overall shape, while inspired by something natural, carries a subtle sense of design. To someone familiar with modern imagery, it might feel faintly reminiscent of a pilot seated within a cockpit. But for the people who created it, there was no such concept, no word for cockpit, no idea of a flying machine. So they reach for something familiar, a turtle, a living creature with a hard shell enclosing a body within. not because it was a perfect match, but because it was close enough. And this is where something quietly profound begins to emerge. Because across cultures, across time, we see this same pattern repeated again and again. Objects described as birds, but behaving unlike any bird. Vehicles described as chariots, but moving without wheels touching the ground. Structures described as divine, but detailed in ways that feel almost mechanical. It is as if the human mind is constantly trying to bridge a gap between what is seen and what can be understood. And the bridge it builds is made of analogy. This doesn't mean the original experience was extraordinary. It doesn't prove that something advanced was present, but it does suggest something important. That the descriptions we have inherited are not direct recordings of events, they are interpretations, filtered through language, through culture, through expectation. And once we begin to see them this way, the stories themselves start to soften. They become less about proving something, and more about revealing how people thought, how they perceived, how they tried to make sense of a world that at times must have felt vast and unpredictable. There is another gentle layer to this idea as well, because even today, with all of our scientific knowledge, all of our instruments and measurements, we still translate the unknown in much the same way. When scientists describe something like the fabric of space, they often use images, stretching, bending, curving, because the reality is far more abstract than words alone can capture. When we talk about time slowing down under certain conditions, we don't experience it directly. We imagine it using comparisons and analogies that help us feel something we cannot easily see. In other words, even now, we're still translating, just with more refined tools, and perhaps that creates a quiet connection between us and the people of the past. Because while the details of our understanding have changed, the process itself remains the same. We observe, we interpret, we translate, and sometimes in that process we reshape what was originally there, not intentionally, not misleadingly, but inevitably. And this brings us to a very gentle but important shift in perspective. Because if ancient descriptions are translations rather than direct accounts, then the question is no longer, were these stories literally true? Instead, it becomes something softer, something more open. What were people trying to describe? What did they experience, even if they couldn't fully explain it? And how much of that experience remains hidden beneath the layers of metaphor that have built up over time? It's a bit like listening to a piece of music that has been covered by many different artists. Each version sounds slightly different. Each interpretation adds something new. But somewhere underneath all of those variations, the original melody still exists, quietly, patiently, waiting to be heard again. And perhaps, as we move forward, that is what we are beginning to do. Not uncovering a single definitive answer, but slowly, gently, listening for that underlying melody. A pattern that may connect stories, sightings, and scientific ideas, not as separate mysteries, but as different expressions of the same deeper question. A question that has followed us for a very long time. What are we really seeing when we don't yet understand what we see? As we continue drifting gently through these layers of story and interpretation, we arrive at something that feels a little different, a little more detailed, a little more structured. Because while many ancient accounts speak in symbols and poetic imagery, there are a few that seem to carry a surprising sense of precision, as if they are not only telling a story, but trying to describe a system. One of the most often discussed examples comes from ancient India, in a collection of texts written in Sanskrit. Within these writings, there are descriptions of flying vehicles known as vimanas. Now, it's important to approach this slowly and carefully. These texts are ancient. They are layered with mythology, philosophy and symbolism, and like all such documents, they have been copied, translated and interpreted many times over. So rather than treating them as literal blueprints, we can think of them as something softer, descriptions, of something that felt real to the people who wrote them. And what makes these descriptions so intriguing is not just that they mention flight, but how they describe it. The Vimanas are not simply said to fly, they are described as moving in different ways, sometimes rising vertically, as if lifting straight upward into the sky, sometimes gliding across distances, sometimes hovering, suspended, as though unaffected by the constant downward pull that shapes everything on Earth. Now, when we hear this today, it's tempting to immediately translate it into modern terms. We might think of aircraft or rockets, or other technologies we understand. But let's pause for a moment. Instead of jumping ahead, let's stay with the perspective of someone living thousands of years ago. Imagine witnessing something rise into the sky, without wings flapping, without visible effort, without any clear connection to the ground. There would be no familiar category for this, no reference point. And yet, the texts attempt to describe it anyway. They speak of crafted structures, objects made, not grown. They mention materials that are shaped and assembled rather than natural. They describe energy, though not in the way we would today, but as a kind of force or power that enables movement. In some passages, there are references to different types of vimanas, each with its own characteristics. Some are said to be used for travel. Others are described in ways that suggest more complex purposes. Again, we don't need to take these descriptions as literal machines, but we can notice something about the language. It feels intentional, less like a dream, more like an attempt to record. And perhaps even more interesting is the way these texts describe the experience of flight itself. Not in numbers or measurements, but in sensations. The feeling of rapid movement, the sudden stillness of hovering, the change in perspective as the ground falls away and the sky opens up. Today, we might describe flight using precise concepts. We might talk about how objects move through air, how forces act on them, how motion changes over time. But in these ancient descriptions, everything is expressed through experience, through what it feels like. And in a way that makes the descriptions more accessible. Because even without technical language, we can still imagine those sensations. We can imagine rising upward, slowly at first, then more quickly. We can imagine looking down and seeing the world become smaller, quieter, more distant. We can imagine the strange calm of being suspended between earth and sky. And perhaps this is why these stories have endured, because they don't just describe something external, they describe something human, the experience of encountering something new, something that stretches the boundaries of what feels possible. There is another layer to these texts as well, a layer that feels surprisingly familiar, even from a modern perspective. Because in some passages there are references not just to the vehicles themselves, but to the people who operate them. Descriptions of pilots, of preparation, of specific conditions required for travel. And while the details are often wrapped in the language of their time, the structure of these descriptions feels almost procedural, as if they are outlining steps, not in the way a modern manual would, but in a way that suggests order, sequence, understanding. And this raises a gentle question. Why would a purely symbolic story include this kind of detail? Why describe preparation or operation or different types of vehicles if the purpose is only mythological? It doesn't provide an answer. But it does open a space for curiosity, a space where we can consider the possibility that some stories are not just symbolic, but also observational. Not entirely fictional, not entirely factual, but something in between, something that reflects both imagination and experience. And perhaps the most fascinating part of all this is not whether Vimanas were real in a physical sense. It is what these descriptions reveal about the human mind. Because even in ancient times, people were not simply passive observers. They were thinkers, interpreters, explorers of possibility. When they encountered something unfamiliar, they didn't just record it. They tried to understand it, to categorize it, to place it within a broader picture of how the world works. And in doing so, they created narratives that were both imaginative and structured. Stories that could be passed down, remembered, and reinterpreted over time. And as we sit here now, thousands of years later, reading those same descriptions, we find ourselves doing something very similar. We're interpreting, translating, trying to understand, but this time with a different set of tools, a different language, a different framework of knowledge, and this creates a quiet bridge between past and present. Because while the content of our understanding has changed, the process itself remains the same. We are still looking up, still wondering, still trying to describe something that feels just slightly beyond our grasp. And as we move forward, we'll begin to explore how these ancient descriptions, whether symbolic, observational, or something in between, connect to something closer to our own time. Because if these stories were attempts to describe unfamiliar motion, then what happens when we encounter that same kind of motion again? But this time, with cameras, with instruments, with modern eyes. As we continue moving gently through these layered accounts, there is a subtle shift that begins to take shape. Until now, many of the stories we have explored have felt poetic, rich with imagery, shaped by metaphor and open to interpretation, but occasionally something different appears. Not just a story, not just a vision, but something that feels organized, structured, almost as if someone long ago was not only describing what they saw, but trying to explain how it worked. And this is where the idea becomes quietly intriguing. Because in some of the ancient Sanskrit texts that describe the Vimanas, there are passages that read less like myth and more like instruction. Not in the precise technical language we use today, but in a way that suggests sequence, preparation, understanding. They speak of different kinds of materials, substances that are shaped and combined to form the structure of these flying craft. They describe sources of power, not with equations or measurements, but as forms of energy or force that enable movement. They even mention conditions for operation, things that must be done before a journey begins. And perhaps most interesting of all, they describe the individuals who operate these vehicles, not as passive passengers, but as trained participants, people who must prepare, who must understand, who must follow certain steps. Now, it's important to stay grounded here. These texts are ancient. They have been interpreted in many ways, and there is no clear evidence that they represent actual machines in the way we understand them today. But what we can observe is something more subtle, the pattern of description. Because when people tell purely symbolic stories, the details tend to be fluid. They change, they adapt, they are guided more by emotion than by structure. But when someone tries to explain how something works, even in a limited way, the language begins to shift. It becomes more ordered, more deliberate, and that is exactly what we see here. Descriptions that move step by step, from the construction of the craft to its operation, to the experience of flight itself. And this raises a gentle but fascinating question. Why would a myth include this kind of structure? Why include details about materials, preparation, or operation, if the goal is simply to tell a symbolic story? One possibility, of course, is that these details are imaginative, that they reflect a kind of early technological dreaming, a way for ancient thinkers to explore what flight might be like long before it became possible. And that in itself is a beautiful idea, because it suggests that even thousands of years ago, people were imagining possibilities far beyond their immediate world. But there is another possibility as well, a quieter one, that these descriptions are not purely invented, but inspired. Not exact records, not blueprints, but echoes, fragments of understanding shaped by experience. Perhaps someone saw something unfamiliar, something structured, something that behaved in a consistent way, and in trying to make sense of it, they described it as best they could, not with the language of science, but with the language of observation, a kind of early attempt to document, to preserve, to pass on what they had witnessed, even if they could not fully explain it. And over time, as these descriptions were copied and retold, they became woven into larger narratives, stories that blended observation with imagination, structure with symbolism, clarity with mystery. There is a quiet parallel here with how knowledge evolves even today. When we first encounter something new, we rarely understand it completely. We describe what we can, we build models, we refine our language over time, and slowly what was once uncertain becomes clearer. But in the early stages, everything exists in a kind of in-between space, not fully known, not entirely unknown, and perhaps that is where these ancient texts live as well. In that space between certainty and curiosity, between imagination and observation, there is another gentle detail worth noticing, because in some of these descriptions there is a sense of limitation, an awareness that certain conditions must be met, that not everyone can simply operate these vehicles, that knowledge is required, preparation is required. And this too feels familiar, because even today complex systems require understanding. You cannot simply step into an aircraft and expect to know how to guide it. There are processes, training, sequences that must be followed carefully, and while the ancient texts do not describe these processes in modern terms, the idea itself is present, a recognition that operation involves more than presence. It involves knowledge, and perhaps that is what gives these passages their quiet sense of realism, not because they prove anything, but because they reflect patterns we recognize, patterns of how humans interact with systems, how we learn, how we prepare, how we attempt to control something that is, at first, beyond us. And as we sit with this idea, gently, without rushing to conclusions, something begins to emerge, not as a definitive answer, but as a possibility. That some ancient stories are not simply narratives, they are layered, containing within them traces of observation, imagination, and early attempts at understanding, and that over time these layers have blended together so seamlessly that it becomes difficult to separate one from the other, which brings us slowly to the next step in our journey. Because if some of these ancient descriptions carry a sense of structure, if they feel at times like fragmented manuals rather than pure myth, then we might begin to ask a slightly different question, not just what people saw, but how those observations might connect to something larger, something that extends beyond a single culture or a single story. Because as we move outward, across continents and civilizations, we begin to notice something else, a repetition, not just of images, but of ideas that seem to echo, quietly, across the world. There is a moment, sometimes late at night, when you become aware of your own thoughts, not the loud ones, the ones tied to plans or worries, but the quieter ones, a simple intention, like deciding to move your hand, and without effort, without instruction, your hand moves, no buttons pressed, no levers pulled, no visible mechanism connecting thought to action, just intention becoming motion. It feels so natural that we rarely stop to consider how remarkable it is. But if you pause for a moment gently, you might notice something curious. Between the thought and the movement, there is no obvious bridge, and yet the connection is there, silent, immediate, seamless. Now, imagine extending that connection just a little further. Imagine that instead of moving your hand, your thoughts could guide something outside your body, a tool, a device, a machine. It may sound like something from a distant future, but in a quiet and gradual way, this idea is already beginning to take shape. Today, researchers are exploring ways for the human brain to communicate directly with machines, not through physical movement, but through patterns of activity, signals that can be detected, interpreted, and translated into action. In simple terms, it's a bit like learning to move a cursor on a screen, just by thinking about it. The process is still developing. It requires careful calibration, patience, and often specialized equipment. But the principle is there. Thought becoming control. And this brings us back, softly, to those ancient descriptions we explored earlier. Because within some of the texts describing flying vehicles, there are references, subtle, often overlooked, to the idea that these craft could be guided not only through physical means, but through something more internal, something closer to intention. Now, it's important to approach this idea gently. These texts do not describe brain signals or neural patterns in the way we understand them today. They do not speak of technology in modern terms. Instead, they use the language available to them. They speak of focus, of discipline, of the connection between the mind and the movement of the craft. And while it would be easy to dismiss this as purely symbolic, there is something quietly interesting about the parallel. Because even today, as we explore new forms of interaction between humans and machines, we are moving slowly toward a similar idea, reducing the distance between intention and action, making the interface more direct, more seamless, more natural. There is a gentle metaphor that can help us feel this more clearly. Imagine you are learning to play a musical instrument. At first, every movement is deliberate. You think about each note, each finger placement, each small adjustment. It feels slow, fragmented, but over time, something changes. The movements become smoother. The connection between thought and action becomes more immediate. Eventually, you're no longer thinking about each note. You're simply playing. Your intention flows directly into motion. And in that moment, the instrument feels less like something external and more like an extension of yourself. Now imagine extending that idea even further. What if a vehicle, a complex system designed for movement, could be operated in a similar way? Not through buttons or controls alone, but through a kind of alignment between the mind and the machine, where focus guides direction, where intention influences motion. Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but gradually, through training and understanding. Again, this is not a claim, it is not a conclusion, it is simply a possibility, a quiet connection between two ideas that exist thousands of years apart, ancient descriptions of thought-guided motion, and modern explorations of mind-machine interaction. And what makes this connection so fascinating is not that it proves anything, but that it reveals a pattern in how humans imagine and gradually develop new ways of interacting with the world. We begin with physical tools, simple extensions of our bodies. Then we create more complex systems, machines that require training, coordination, and skill. And over time, we seek to make those systems more intuitive, more responsive, more closely aligned with our natural way of thinking. It is a slow progression, a gentle unfolding, from effort toward ease, from separation toward integration. And perhaps that is what we are seeing reflected in a very early form in those ancient texts, not a fully realized technology, not a literal system as we might imagine it today, but an idea, an intuition, that the boundary between mind and movement might not be as fixed as it seems, that one day the gap between thinking and doing could become smaller, quieter, more direct. There is something calming about this idea, because it suggests that even as technology evolves, it may move closer to something deeply human, not more complicated, but more aligned, more intuitive, more connected to the way we already experience the world from within. And as we sit with this thought gently, we begin to notice how it fits into the larger pattern we've been exploring. Ancient stories describing unfamiliar experiences, translated through the language of the time, modern science slowly uncovering possibilities that echo those descriptions, not exactly but in spirit, and between them, a quiet continuity, a sense that human curiosity has always been reaching in the same direction, trying to understand movement, connection, and the invisible links between thought and reality. As we continue, we'll begin to expand this perspective even further, because when we step back, not just from a single culture or a single text, but from the entire world, we begin to see something even more remarkable, not just isolated ideas, but patterns that appear again and again, across continents, across centuries, like echoes, soft, persistent, and strangely familiar. As we move a little further outward, away from individual stories and into a wider view, something gentle begins to take shape. Not a single narrative, not a single culture, but a pattern, a quiet repetition that appears in places separated by oceans, languages, and time itself. And to notice it, we don't need to rush. We simply need to place a few stories side by side and listen. In South Asia, there are accounts of flying vehicles moving with intention, guided by those who understand them. In the Middle East, stories speak of kings travelling across vast distances through the air, carried by something that glides without effort. In parts of Africa, there are legends of sky beings who descend, interact with humans, and then return to the heavens. In Mesoamerica, carvings and traditions describe figures associated with the sky, sometimes arriving, sometimes departing, often linked with knowledge or transformation. In ancient Greece, the gods are rarely grounded. They arrive from above, often in radiant vehicles, bringing with them both power and mystery. And in East Asia, stories emerge of journeys to other realms, places where time flows differently, where a short visit can correspond to many years passing on Earth. Now, each of these traditions is unique. Each is shaped by its environment, its beliefs, its language. But when we step back, something subtle begins to appear. The similarities are not exact, they are not identical copies, but they rhyme, like verses in different songs that share the same underlying melody. And perhaps the most interesting part is not the specific details, but the structure, because again and again we see the same elements returning, beings or objects arriving from above, movement through the sky that feels effortless or unusual, journeys that seem to transcend normal distance, or even time, encounters that leave a lasting impression even when they are not fully understood. Now, there are many ways to interpret this. One possibility is that these similarities arise from shared human imagination. After all, people everywhere look up at the sky. It is natural to wonder what might exist beyond it. It is natural to imagine beings that come from above, because above has always felt like the direction of mystery. And there is truth in that. Human minds, though shaped by different cultures, often follow similar patterns. We dream in similar ways. We tell stories that explore similar themes. And so, It is entirely possible that these shared motifs are simply reflections of a shared human experience. But there is another possibility as well, a quieter one, that what we are seeing is not just repetition of imagination, but repetition of observation. Not identical observations, not consistent in every detail, but similar enough to suggest that something, some kind of experience, may have occurred in different places at different times, leaving behind traces that were interpreted through local understanding. And this is where the idea becomes gently intriguing, because if the same kinds of descriptions appear across cultures that had little or no contact with each other, we are left with a simple question. Why? Why do these patterns appear again and again? Is it because the human mind naturally creates them? Or is it because the human mind is responding to something and translating it in different ways? We don't need to answer that question right now. In fact, it's better if we don't, because the purpose here is not to decide, but to observe, to notice the pattern without forcing it into a conclusion. There is a soft metaphor that can help us hold this idea more comfortably. Imagine standing on different shores around the world, listening to the ocean. Each place has its own sound. The rhythm of the waves changes. The shoreline shapes the movement differently. The wind adds its own texture. And yet, beneath all of those variations, it is still the same ocean, the same water, moving in different ways, shaped by different environments. Now, the stories we've been exploring may be something like that. Different expressions, different interpretations, but possibly shaped by something deeper, something shared. Not necessarily a single event, not necessarily a single cause, but kind of recurring experience that human beings across time have tried to understand. And as we sit with that idea, gently, another layer begins to unfold. Because if these patterns are real, whether they come from imagination, observation, or something in between, then they might not exist in isolation. They might connect, not just as stories, but as part of a larger system, a broader picture that becomes visible only when we look at everything together. And this is where the perspective begins to shift again, from individual accounts to global patterns, from isolated myths to interconnected ideas. Because when we start to map these stories, not geographically but conceptually, we begin to see that they are not scattered randomly. They cluster around certain themes, certain locations, certain kinds of experiences, and slowly, very slowly, a new possibility begins to take shape, not as a claim, not as a certainty, but as a question. What if these patterns are not just echoes of human imagination, but traces of something that once connected different parts of the world, something that moved, something that appeared in multiple places, something that for brief moments brought distant cultures into contact with the same kind of mystery? And if that were the case, then the next step becomes even more interesting, because connection implies structure, and structure implies something more than isolated events. It suggests a system, a network. Not necessarily in the way we think of networks today, with wires and signals and visible infrastructure, but in a quieter, more subtle sense, a pattern of movement, of presence, of repeated interaction. And as we move forward, we'll begin to explore that possibility, not by trying to prove that such a network existed, but by gently examining the places where these patterns seem to gather, places that feel intentional, structured, prepared, as if they were not just locations, but points within something larger, points that may have played a role in connecting the sky to the earth. As we gently widen our view, something begins to shift again. Up until now, we've been noticing patterns in stories, echoes that appear across cultures, across time. quietly repeating themselves in different forms. But what happens if we take one more step back? If we stop looking only at the stories and begin to look at the places where those stories seem to gather? Because sometimes meaning is not just found in what is said, but in where it appears. Imagine, for a moment, looking at the surface of the earth, not as we usually do, with countries and borders, but as a landscape of points, mountains, plateaus, vast open plains, regions that feel remote yet strangely significant. Now imagine placing markers on that landscape, not randomly, but based on where certain kinds of structures or patterns are found. Large geometric shapes etched into the ground, flattened mountaintops, sites that seem deliberately shaped, as if prepared for a purpose that is not immediately obvious. One of the most well-known examples lies in the dry plains of southern Peru. There across the desert surface stretch enormous lines, some straight, some forming shapes, visible only from a great height. These lines extend for long distances, intersecting, diverging, creating patterns that feel both simple and mysterious. From the ground, they are difficult to fully perceive, but from above, they reveal themselves more clearly. Now, there are many grounded explanations for these formations. They may have been created for ceremonial purposes, they may have been pathways or markers aligned with celestial events, and these explanations are important. They remind us to stay balanced, to consider what we know as well as what we don't. But even within those explanations, there is something quietly interesting, because the scale of these designs suggests intention, planning, a perspective that seems to anticipate being seen from above. And this is where the idea begins to soften into something more expansive, because this is not the only place where we find such features. In parts of Mexico, there are ancient cities built on flattened mountaintops, places where the natural shape of the land has been altered to create broad, level surfaces. In other regions, there are large stone structures aligned in ways that suggest careful measurement and positioning. And across different continents, there are sites that, while unique in their details, share a similar feeling, a sense of preparation, of shaping the environment for a purpose that extends beyond simple shelter or defense. Now, again, we move gently. We do not rush to conclusions. We do not assume that these places were designed for flight or for anything specific. But we can ask a softer question. What if these locations were not isolated? What if they were part of something larger? A pattern not just in stories, but in space itself? There is a quiet analogy that may help here. Think of modern travel. Airports are not placed randomly. They appear at strategic locations, spaced in ways that allow movement across long distances. Each one serves as a point within a broader system, a network that connects distant places through structured pathways. Now imagine trying to understand such a system without knowing what it is. If you encountered these locations individually, you might see them as isolated structures. But if you mapped them together, a pattern would begin to emerge, not perfectly aligned, not evenly spaced, but connected in a way that suggests purpose. And this is the perspective we are slowly exploring. Not that ancient structures were necessarily airports in the way we understand them today, but that there may have been patterns of placement, patterns of construction that reflect something more than randomness, something more than coincidence. Because when we combine this spatial perspective with the patterns we've already seen in stories, something begins to take shape, a gentle possibility that the experiences described in ancient myths, the movements observed in the sky, and the locations built or shaped on the earth may not be entirely separate. They may be different expressions of the same deeper phenomenon, seen from different angles, interpreted through different lenses. There is another layer to this idea that feels almost poetic. Because many of these locations, these vast plains, these elevated plateaus, share a common quality. They are open, unobstructed, connected directly to the sky, places where the horizon stretches wide and the boundary between earth and sky feels softer, and perhaps that in itself is meaningful, not as evidence, but as a feeling, a sense that certain places invite attention upward, invite observation, invite interaction. And whether that interaction was symbolic, ceremonial, or something else entirely, it creates a quiet link between location and experience, between place and perception. As we sit with this idea, we begin to notice how it complements everything we've explored so far. Stories that describe movement through the sky, observations of objects behaving in unusual ways, descriptions of journeys that transcend ordinary distance, and now, places that seem to echo those themes, spaces that feel prepared, intentional, open to something beyond the everyday. None of this forms a complete picture on its own, but together they begin to suggest a pattern, not a rigid structure, not a clearly defined system, but a soft alignment of ideas, a sense that human history may contain traces of something that moved, something that appeared, something that left impressions not only in stories but in the landscape itself. And as we move forward, this leads us gently into another layer of the mystery. Because if the earth holds patterns that feel intentional, and if ancient stories describe experiences that feel unfamiliar, then we might begin to ask one more question. What if some knowledge, some understanding, existed in the past that we have not fully explained, not necessarily advanced in the way we define advancement today, but different, unexpected, quietly out of place? And this is where we begin to explore something even more subtle, not just structures on the ground, but maps, representations of the world itself, and the possibility that, in some cases, those representations may reflect a perspective that feels just slightly ahead of its time. As we continue this slow unfolding, we arrive at something that feels both familiar and quietly unsettling. Maps, simple, everyday objects. At least that's how we tend to think of them. Flat representations of a curved world, tools for navigation, ways of turning vast landscapes into something we can hold, study, and understand. But if you pause for a moment, there is something deeply remarkable about a map. Because a map is not just a drawing, it is a perspective. It is a way of seeing the world from above, even when you have never been there. And for most of human history, that perspective was limited. People mapped what they could travel, what they could observe directly, what they could piece together from stories and journeys passed from one generation to the next. Which is why early maps often feel incomplete. Edges fade into uncertainty, coastlines distort, unknown regions are left blank or filled with imagination. And yet, scattered among these early attempts at understanding the world, there are a few maps that seem different, not perfect, not entirely accurate, but carrying details that feel surprisingly advanced for their time. One of the most frequently discussed examples is a map created in the early 16th century, known today as the Piri-Reis map. At first glance, it appears to show parts of Europe, Africa and South America, regions that were known, at least in part, through exploration. But what has drawn attention over the years is not what the map includes, but how certain parts are represented. Some sections of coastline appear with a level of detail that seems unusually refined. Others suggest shapes that resemble regions not fully explored or mapped at the time, and in some interpretations there are features that appear to correspond to areas that would not be formally documented until much later. Now, it's important to move carefully here. Maps are complex. They are built from multiple sources, fragments of knowledge, traveller accounts, earlier maps, and sometimes even educated guesses. Distortions are common. coincidences happen, and interpretations can vary widely depending on how we choose to compare shapes and features. So rather than treating any single map as evidence of something extraordinary, we can approach this more gently, as a question. How did certain maps come to include details that feel ahead of their time? There are grounded explanations. Perhaps the mapmakers had access to earlier sources that are now lost. Perhaps knowledge travelled further than we assume, carried along trade routes, shared between cultures in ways that were not fully recorded. Perhaps what appears precise to us is, in part, a result of how we are interpreting the shapes today. All of these possibilities are reasonable, and they remind us to stay balanced, to avoid jumping too quickly toward conclusions. But even within that balanced view, there is something quietly intriguing about the idea of perspective. Because creating a map, especially one that captures large regions, requires more than local observation. It requires a sense of scale, of proportion, of how different parts of the world relate to one another. And in modern times, we achieve that perspective through tools, satellites orbiting high above the Earth, images captured from space, measurements taken with extraordinary precision. But in the distant past, that kind of view was not available, at least not in the way we understand it today. And so, when we encounter maps that seem to carry hints of a broader perspective, it invites a gentle curiosity. Not about whether they are correct in a strict sense, but about how they were constructed, what sources contributed to them, what knowledge, partial or complete, may have been available. There is a soft analogy that may help us sit with this idea. Imagine trying to assemble a puzzle, but instead of having all the pieces neatly arranged, you're given fragments, some from one box, some from another, some worn, some incomplete, and slowly, carefully, you begin to place them together. At first, the image is unclear, but as more pieces connect, a picture begins to form, not perfectly, not fully, but enough to suggest a larger structure. And perhaps that is what early map making was like. A gradual assembly of knowledge, fragments brought together over time, refined, adjusted, reinterpreted with each new addition. And yet, within that process, there may have been moments, small glimpses, where the picture came into focus more clearly than expected. Moments where the combination of sources created something that felt just a little more complete than it should have been. Now, whether those moments reflect lost knowledge, coincidence, or something else entirely, is not something we need to decide. What matters is the pattern, because just as we have seen recurring themes in stories, and recurring behaviours in observations of the sky, we now see something similar in representations of the Earth itself, attempts to understand, to map, to place ourselves within a larger whole. And perhaps that is the deeper connection, not that ancient maps reveal a hidden truth outright, but that they are part of the same human effort we have been tracing all along. The effort to make sense of something vast, something complex, something that extends far beyond immediate experience. And in doing so, they reflect both the limits and the reach of human understanding. There is something calming about this, because it reminds us that knowledge does not appear all at once. It unfolds, slowly, through observation, interpretation, and the sharing of ideas across time. And sometimes, along that path, we encounter moments that feel surprising, moments that hint at something more, not fully explained, not fully understood, but present nonetheless. And as we move forward, this leads us gently into another layer of the story. Because while maps attempt to represent space, there is another dimension that appears again and again in ancient accounts. Not distance, not location, but time. Stories where time does not flow in the way we expect, where a short journey becomes a long absence, where moments stretch or compress in ways that feel almost impossible. And as we begin to explore those stories, we may find that they too carry echoes, quiet reflections of ideas that science is only beginning to describe. As we move gently from maps and ancient perspectives into something closer to our own time, there is a subtle shift in how the mystery begins to feel. The stories are no longer carved in stone or written in fading ink. They are recorded, observed, sometimes even captured, briefly, through instruments and devices designed to measure the world with precision. And yet, despite all of this, something remains, just out of reach. Because in the modern era, people are still looking up, still noticing moments when the sky behaves in ways that feel unfamiliar, still trying to describe objects that do not quite follow the patterns we expect. Now, unlike in ancient times, we have a different set of tools. We have aircraft that move through the sky in controlled, predictable ways. We understand how objects travel through air, how they lift, how they turn, how they slow down. We can measure speed, we can track direction, we can observe motion in ways that were not possible before. And because of this, when something behaves differently, it becomes easier to notice, not just as a feeling, but as a contrast, a clear difference between what is expected and what is observed. There have been reports over the years of objects that move with a kind of smoothness that feels unusual, not jerky, not struggling against resistance, but gliding, shifting direction in ways that seem almost effortless. Sometimes these objects are described as moving very quickly, faster than anything visible in the sky should be able to move without producing certain effects. At other times they appear to hover, remaining still, suspended in the air, without visible support. And perhaps the most intriguing descriptions are those that combine these behaviors, objects that move rapidly, then stop, that change direction suddenly, without the gradual curve we expect from turning motion, that appear and then vanish. Now, it is important to approach this carefully, because many things can create unusual visual impressions, light reflecting off surfaces, atmospheric conditions bending and scattering what we see, objects moving at a distance, where depth and scale become difficult to judge. And of course, human perception itself is not perfect. We interpret what we see based on context, expectation, and experience. So there are many grounded explanations for unusual sightings, and those explanations matter. They help us stay connected to what we know, to what can be tested and understood. But even with those considerations, there are still moments, rare but persistent, where the descriptions feel consistent, not identical, but similar in a way that echoes something we've already encountered, a pattern of movement that feels unfamiliar. And this is where something quietly interesting begins to happen. Because when people today try to describe these movements, they often reach for comparisons, just as people did in the past. They might say an object moved like nothing they'd seen before, or that it changed direction as if it didn't need to slow down, or that it hovered as though the usual pull downward simply didn't apply in the same way. Notice how these descriptions are still rooted in feeling, in comparison. Even with all of our measurements and knowledge, we still rely on analogy when something falls outside our expectations. And this creates a gentle bridge between past and present, because the experience, the attempt to describe the unfamiliar, remains the same, only the language has evolved. In ancient times, a person might describe something as a chariot in the sky. Today, someone might describe something as an object that moves in ways our current aircraft do not. Different words, but a similar sense of surprise, a similar effort to translate what is seen into something understandable. There is a soft way to think about this that can help us hold it without tension. Imagine watching a leaf floating on water. It drifts slowly, carried by currents you cannot see. Now imagine placing a small motor beneath that leaf, something hidden, something that allows it to move differently. Suddenly, the motion changes. It no longer drifts. It turns, pauses, accelerates. To someone who does not see the mechanism, the movement feels unusual, not impossible, but unexpected. And perhaps that is the feeling people describe in these modern observations. Not that something breaks the rules of the world, but that it seems to follow a different set of rules than the ones we're familiar with. A different interaction, with motion, with resistance, with the forces that shape how objects move through space. Now, we are not saying that such objects represent unknown technology. We are not making claims about their origin. We are simply noticing the pattern, the way they are described, the way those descriptions echo earlier accounts, not in detail, but in essence. Movement that feels effortless, direction that changes without hesitation, presence that appears and disappears. And as we sit with this idea, gently, it begins to connect with something we have already explored. The possibility that human beings across time have encountered moments where motion did not behave as expected. Moments that were recorded, described, translated into the language available at the time, and now, in the present, we find ourselves doing the same thing again, observing, describing, trying to understand, but with more refined tools, more precise language, and yet, still with a sense of uncertainty, still with that quiet pause in the mind, that moment where something does not quite fit. And as we move forward, this leads us to another layer of the question. Because if something appears to move differently, if it seems to interact with the world in a way that feels unusual, then we might begin to ask, what kind of movement is this? Not faster necessarily, not stronger, but different. And to explore that, we will gently step into an idea that may sound complex at first, but can be understood in a very simple, very intuitive way. The idea that motion is not only about pushing through space, but sometimes about changing the way space itself is experienced. There is a quiet assumption we carry with us, almost without noticing. That movement requires effort. If you want to move forward, you push. If you want to rise, you lift. If you want to change direction, you turn gradually, adjusting your path as you go. This is how we experience the world. A car accelerates along a road. A bird flaps its wings to stay in the air. An airplane moves forward, relying on speed and shape to remain aloft. Everything we see seems to follow the same gentle rule. Movement happens within the world, and the world resists. Air pushes back. Gravity pulls downward. Surfaces create friction. And so, motion becomes a kind of negotiation, a balance between force and resistance. Now, imagine for a moment that this balance could change, not disappear entirely, but shift. Imagine that instead of pushing against the air, something could move in a way that reduces that resistance, or perhaps even bypasses it. It's a difficult idea to picture at first because it doesn't match our everyday experience, but we can approach it slowly, using something simple. Think of the difference between walking on rough ground and gliding across ice. On rough ground, each step requires effort. Your feet push against the surface pushes back. Movement feels controlled, but also resisted. Now imagine stepping onto a perfectly smooth sheet of ice. Suddenly, the relationship changes. A small push sends you sliding. Turning becomes more fluid. Movement feels less like effort and more like flow. The resistance is still there, but it is reduced, and because of that, motion appears different, more continuous, more effortless. Now, this is just an analogy, but it helps us gently approach a deeper idea, because when people describe certain unusual objects, Whether in ancient accounts or modern observations, they often describe movement that feels less like pushing and more like gliding, less like forcing through the environment and more like moving with it. And this is where the concept begins to shift, because what if movement is not only about applying force, but also about changing the conditions in which movement happens? Instead of asking, how fast is something going? We might ask, what kind of environment is it moving through? Or even more softly, is it interacting with the environment in the same way we're used to? In modern science, there are ideas that explore how space itself behaves, not as an empty stage where motion simply takes place, but as something that can stretch, bend, and respond. This might sound abstract, but we can bring it back to something simple. Imagine a flexible surface, like a stretched piece of fabric. If you place a heavy object on it, the fabric dips. If you roll a small ball nearby, its path curves, not because something is pulling it directly, but because the surface itself has changed. Now, we're not saying that objects in the sky are bending space in this way. That would require conditions far beyond anything we currently understand in practical terms. But the idea itself is useful, because it reminds us that movement is not only about objects, but also about the space they move through. And when people describe motion that seems unusual, sudden changes in direction, smooth acceleration, hovering without visible effort, it invites a gentle question. Could there be a different relationship between the object and its environment? Not breaking the rules of motion, but interacting with them in a way that feels unfamiliar. There is another way to think about this. Imagine you are in a river. If you swim against the current, you feel resistance. You have to push harder, work more, move carefully. But if you turn and move with the current, everything changes. Your movement becomes smoother, faster, less effortful. You're still moving, but the experience feels entirely different. Now imagine if you can not only follow the current, but also shift it, guide it, create a small path where the flow moves in the direction you want to go. Again, this is just a metaphor, but it helps us soften the idea. Movement not as force alone, but as a relationship between object and environment, between intention and response. And perhaps this is why certain descriptions feel so unusual, because they do not match the kind of movement we are familiar with. They feel like motion without struggle, direction without delay, presence without obvious effort. And when we encounter something like that, the mind pauses, just as it did in ancient times, just as it does today. It searches for a way to understand, to translate, to fit what is seen into the patterns it already knows, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But always with that same quiet curiosity. Now, it's important to remain grounded here. These ideas about changing how movement interacts with the environment are still largely theoretical when it comes to practical application. They belong more to exploration than to established technology, and many observations of unusual motion can be explained through more familiar means: perspective, distance, optical effects. All of these play a role, but even with that in mind, the pattern remains worth noticing, not as proof, but as a point of reflection, a reminder that our understanding of movement, like all understanding, evolves over time. What feels impossible in one era can become intuitive in another, and sometimes the first hints of that shift appear not in equations or experiments, but in descriptions, in the way people try to explain what they see when something doesn't quite fit. And as we move forward, this gentle shift in perspective opens the door to another idea. Because if movement can feel different depending on how it interacts with its environment, then perhaps distance itself can feel different as well, not necessarily shorter, but experienced in a way that changes how we perceive it. And that is where we begin to explore something that has captured human imagination for a very long time. The possibility that travelling far might not always mean taking the long way around. As we continue drifting through these ideas, we arrive at a question that feels both simple and quietly profound. When we travel from one place to another, what does it really mean to move? Most of the time, we imagine it as a straight journey, a path stretching from where we are to where we want to go. If the distance is long, the journey takes time. If the distance is short, we arrive more quickly. It feels obvious, almost too obvious to question. But what if the path itself could change? Not the speed at which we move, but the shape of the journey. Let's imagine something simple, a sheet of paper, flat, smooth, stretched out in front of you. Now place two small points on that sheet, one on the left, one on the right. If you wanted to move from one point to the other, you would trace a line across the surface. The longer the line, the more distance you travel. Now, gently fold the paper. Bring the 2 points closer together, not by moving across the surface, but by changing the shape of the paper itself. Suddenly, those two distant points are no longer far apart, they are touching. And instead of travelling across the entire sheet, you could simply move through the fold, a much shorter path. Now, this is just an analogy, but it captures a very important idea, because in modern physics there are concepts that suggest something similar might be possible, not with paper, but with space itself. The idea that space is not fixed and rigid, but flexible, capable under certain conditions of bending or connecting distant regions in unexpected ways. These hypothetical connections are often referred to as wormholes, but the name itself can sound a little intimidating, so let's keep it simple. Instead of thinking of them as tunnels or holes, we can think of them as shortcuts, not faster movement, but shorter paths. And that distinction matters, because nothing is actually moving faster than the natural limits we understand. Instead, the distance itself is being gently rearranged, or at least that is the idea. Now, it's important to stay grounded here. There is no confirmed evidence that such shortcuts exist in a usable form. They are part of theoretical exploration, ideas that arise from our best attempts to understand how space behaves under extreme conditions. And even if such connections were possible, creating or stabilizing them would require conditions far beyond anything we can currently achieve. So this is not a technology we have, it is a possibility we're exploring. But even as a possibility, it offers something valuable, a new way of thinking about distance. Because if movement is not only about speed, but also about the structure of space itself, then our intuitive understanding of travel begins to soften. It becomes less about pushing harder or moving faster, and more about finding a different path, a quieter path, a path that might not be visible from the surface. There is a gentle metaphor that can help us feel this more clearly. Imagine walking through a large city. You could follow the streets, turning at each corner, moving step by step toward your destination. Or, if there were a hidden passage, a doorway that connects two distant parts of the city, you could step through it and arrive almost instantly. You're not moving faster, you're simply taking a different route, one that bypasses the usual distance. And perhaps this is why the idea of shortcuts through space feels so compelling. Because it doesn't require breaking the rules. It only requires seeing the world in a slightly different way. Now, let's bring this gently back to the patterns we've been exploring. Ancient stories of journeys that seem to cover vast distances in surprisingly short periods. Accounts of beings arriving from far away without clear indication of how they travelled. Descriptions of movement that feels disconnected from the usual sense of distance. In many cases, these stories are symbolic. They reflect imagination, belief, and the desire to explore what lies beyond. But when we place them alongside modern ideas about how space might behave, something subtle begins to emerge. Not a direct connection, not a confirmation, but a resonance, a similarity in how the idea of travel is imagined. Not always as a long journey through space, but sometimes as a transition, a shift, a movement that feels less like crossing distance and more like stepping between places. Again, we are not saying that ancient people understood these concepts in scientific terms. They did not describe space as flexible or speak of connections between distant regions, but they did describe experiences that feel, in a very soft way, compatible with the idea. Journeys that are too short for the distance involved, returns that feel disconnected from the time that has passed, movement that does not follow the expected path, and perhaps that is enough, not to prove anything, but to invite curiosity, to suggest that the human imagination and human experience has long been drawn to the idea that distance might not be as fixed as it seems, that there may be more than one way to move through the world. And as we sit with that thought gently, it leads us to another layer of the story. Because if space can, in theory, be shaped, and if distance can, in some sense, be shortened, then there is another dimension that becomes even more interesting. Time. Because just as space may not be as rigid as it appears, time too may have its own quiet flexibility. Not something we feel in our everyday lives, but something that reveals itself under certain conditions. And as we begin to explore that idea, we may find that some of the oldest stories we have already been hinting at it. As we continue this gentle unfolding, we arrive at something that feels even more subtle than distance, because while space can be imagined as stretching or folding, time feels different, more constant, more reliable. It moves forward, one moment after another, like a quiet stream that never stops, or at least that is how it seems. We wake up, the day begins, and time flows. We move through it, rarely questioning its pace. It feels steady, predictable, almost absolute. And yet, when we turn our attention to certain ancient stories, we begin to notice something curious. Moments where time does not behave in the way we expect, not dramatically, not loudly, but quietly, almost gently, as if it slips. There is an ancient story from India about a king named Ravata. According to the tale, he travels to a distant realm, often described as a heavenly place, to meet a divine being. The journey itself feels brief, a visit, a conversation. But when he returns to Earth, something has changed. What felt like a short absence has in fact been much longer. Generations have passed. The world he knew is no longer the same, and he finds himself standing in a time that has moved on without him. Now, if we move across the world, we find a story from Japan that feels strikingly similar. It tells of a fisherman named Urashima. One day, he's taken to an underwater palace, a place of beauty and calm where time seems almost suspended. He stays there for what feels like only a few days, but when he returns home, he discovers that many years have passed. His village is gone. The people he knew have faded into history, and once again we see the same quiet pattern, a short experience, becoming a long absence, a personal timeline, drifting out of sync with the world. And this is not limited to these two stories. In different forms, across different cultures, similar narratives appear. Journeys to other realms, encounters that feel brief, returns that reveal a passage of time far greater than expected. Now, it would be easy to treat these as purely symbolic, Stories about change, about loss, about the feeling of returning to a world that has moved on. And those interpretations are meaningful. They reflect deep human experiences. But there is another layer we can gently explore, not as an explanation, but as a parallel. Because in modern physics there is an idea, well established, carefully tested, that time does not always pass at the same rate for everyone. It can change, not in our everyday experience, but under certain conditions. For example, when something moves very quickly, approaching the fastest speeds possible in the universe, time for that moving object can pass more slowly compared to someone who remains still. This is not a metaphor. It is something that has been measured and confirmed in precise experiments. Clocks moving at high speeds tick just a little more slowly than clocks at rest. The difference is small in everyday situations, but it becomes more noticeable as speed increases. There's also another factor, gravity. The presence of a strong gravitational field, such as near a very massive object, can also influence how time flows. In regions where gravity is stronger, time passes slightly more slowly compared to regions where gravity is weaker. Again, this effect is subtle in most situations, but it is real. Now, we are not suggesting that ancient stories were describing these scientific ideas directly. They were not measuring time with clocks. They were not calculating differences in rates. But what they were describing, at least in a narrative sense, feels similar. The experience of time behaving differently depending on where you are and how you travel. A journey that feels short but results in a long absence. A return to a world that has aged more than you have. And perhaps what makes this connection so interesting is not that it proves anything, but that it shows how human imagination and perhaps human experience has long been drawn to this idea that time is not always fixed, that it can stretch, compress, slip. There is a gentle way to feel this idea even in everyday life. Think about how time feels when you're deeply engaged in something. Perhaps you're listening to music or reading a book or sitting quietly in thought. Hours can pass, and yet it feels like only a few moments. And at other times when you're waiting, or uncomfortable or restless, even a few minutes can feel long. Of course, this is not the same as physical changes in time. It is perception. But it reminds us that our experience of time is not as simple as a ticking clock. It is flexible, subjective, responsive, and perhaps that is why stories of time slipping feel so natural to us. Because even without scientific understanding, we have always sensed that time is not as rigid as it seems, that it can behave in ways that are not immediately obvious. And when ancient storytellers tried to express that idea, they did so through narrative, through journeys, through encounters that shift the flow of time, not as equations, but as experiences. And as we sit with this, gently, it begins to connect with everything we've explored so far. Movement that feels different, distance that may not be as fixed as it appears, and now, time that can, under certain conditions, unfold in unexpected ways. Each idea on its own is intriguing, but together they begin to form something larger. A quiet suggestion that the world may be more flexible than our everyday experience reveals. Not chaotic, not unpredictable, but layered, subtle, containing possibilities that we're only beginning to understand. And as we move forward, this leads us to a deeper exploration. Because if time can change depending on movement and environment, then we must also consider something else. What happens when we try to move not just forward through time, but backward? What happens when we imagine returning to a moment that has already passed? And what does that reveal about the nature of time itself? There is something deeply comforting about a clock. The steady ticking, the regular movement of its hands, the sense that time is flowing in a clear, measurable way, second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour. It gives us structure, a way to organize our days, a way to feel that the world is moving forward in a predictable rhythm. And for most of human history, this rhythm was taken as something absolute. Time was thought to be the same for everyone, flowing evenly, everywhere, like a universal heartbeat that never changed. But as our understanding of the universe deepened, something unexpected began to emerge. A quiet realization. That time is not quite as fixed as it seems. It does not flow in exactly the same way for every observer. It can stretch, it can slow, and under certain conditions it can behave in ways that feel almost counterintuitive. Now, we don't need to dive into complex mathematics to understand this. In fact, it's better if we don't. Instead, let's approach it gently, through something we can imagine. Picture yourself on a long journey. You board a spacecraft, not one we have today, but something capable of travelling at extraordinary speed. As you move faster and faster, approaching the highest speeds possible in the universe, something subtle begins to happen. Time, for you, begins to slow down. Not in a way you would notice directly. Your heartbeat feels the same. Your thoughts flow as usual. Everything around you seems normal, but compared to someone who remains on Earth, time is passing differently. When you eventually return, you may find that more time has passed for them than for you. What felt like a few years to you may have been decades for someone else. This is not a story. It is not a metaphor. It is a real, measured effect, verified through experiments involving precise clocks. Clocks placed on fast-moving objects tick just a little more slowly than those at rest. The difference is small in everyday situations, but it becomes more noticeable as speed increases, and this is one of the key ideas of modern physics, that time is not separate from motion, it is connected to it, shaped by it. Now, there is another factor as well, gravity. We often think of gravity as something that pulls objects downward, keeps us grounded, holds planets in orbit, but it also has a quieter influence. It affects how time flows. In regions where gravity is stronger, near very massive objects, time passes more slowly compared to regions where gravity is weaker. Again, this is not something we feel directly, but it has been measured, carefully, repeatedly. Even small differences in height can create tiny differences in how time flows. A clock placed slightly higher above the Earth's surface will tick just a little faster than one placed lower. The difference is incredibly small. But it is there, and it tells us something important. That time is not a fixed background. It is part of the fabric of the universe itself, interwoven with space, responsive to motion and mass. Now, this might sound abstract, but we can bring it back to something simple. Imagine time not as a straight line, but as a kind of landscape. A landscape that can stretch and curve. Most of the time, we move across this landscape without noticing any change. It feels flat, uniform. But in certain regions, under certain conditions, the shape of that landscape changes. And when it does, the way time flows changes with it. This is a quiet shift in perspective, from seeing time as something constant to seeing it as something dynamic. And once we begin to see it that way, many things start to feel different, because the idea of time slipping, of experiences where time behaves unexpectedly, no longer feels purely imaginary. It becomes something that exists in principle within the structure of the universe. Not in everyday life, not in the simple passage of days, but in the deeper layers of how reality is organized. And perhaps this is why those ancient stories feel so compelling. Because even without scientific language, they touch on something real. The possibility that time is not as rigid as it appears, that it can, under certain conditions, unfold in ways that surprise us. Now, there is a gentle boundary we should keep in mind. While moving forward through time, experiencing time at a different rate is supported by our understanding of physics. Moving backward through time is far more uncertain. It raises questions, not just technical ones, but logical ones. Because if you could return to a moment in the past, what would happen to the events that have already unfolded? Could they change, or are they fixed? And if they could change, what would that mean for everything that followed? These are not easy questions, and they do not have clear answers, but they lead us into something even more fascinating. Because when we begin to think about moving through time in different directions, we encounter something known as a paradox, a situation where our intuition and our logic begin to pull in different directions. And as we move forward, we will explore these ideas gently, not as problems to solve, but as reflections of how complex and how beautiful the nature of time truly is. Because sometimes the most interesting discoveries are not the answers we find, but the questions that remain. As we continue this gentle exploration, we arrive at a place where curiosity meets something a little more delicate. Because once we begin to understand that time is not entirely fixed, that it can stretch, slow, and shift under certain conditions, a quiet question naturally follows. If time can change its pace, could it also change its direction? Could we in some way return to a moment that has already passed? At first, the idea feels almost familiar. We revisit the past all the time, in memory. We replay moments in our minds. We imagine different outcomes, different choices, different paths. But this is not the same as physically returning. Memory allows us to observe the past, but not to interact with it. And yet, the thought remains. What would happen if we could? Now, as soon as we begin to imagine this, something interesting occurs. The mind starts to encounter tension. Not emotional tension, but logical tension. A kind of gentle contradiction that doesn't quite resolve itself. There is a classic example often used to illustrate this. Imagine that you could travel back in time to a point before you were born, and imagine that in some way you prevented your own existence. If that were to happen, then you would never have existed. And if you never existed, then you could not have travelled back in time in the first place, which means the event could not have happened. And yet, we began by imagining that it did. This creates a loop, a circle of cause and effect that does not close neatly. It simply turns back on itself. Now, we don't need to focus on the specifics of this example. What matters is the feeling it creates, a sense that time, when treated as something we can move through freely in both directions, leads to situations that feel unstable, situations where cause and effect begin to blur, where the sequence of events becomes difficult to follow, and this is what is often referred to as a paradox, not a mistake, not an error, but a sign that our understanding may be incomplete, that the way we are imagining time might not fully match how it actually behaves. There is another gentle example that feels less dramatic, but just as revealing. Imagine receiving a piece of information from the future, perhaps a design, an idea, something you had not yet created. You take that information, bring it into the present, and use it to build something, but then later you travel back and give that same information to your earlier self. In this scenario, the information exists, it is real. But where did it come from? It was never created in the usual sense. It simply exists within the loop, passed from future to past and back again. This too creates a kind of quiet tension, not because it is impossible to imagine, but because it challenges our sense of origin, our sense that things begin somewhere, that they have a clear starting point, and when that starting point disappears, the mind pauses, just as it did when we first encountered unfamiliar motion, just as it does when we think about time flowing differently. It searches for a way to understand. Now, there are many ways scientists and thinkers approach these ideas. Some suggest that travelling into the past may not be possible in the way we imagine, that the structure of time itself may prevent such loops from forming. Others explore the possibility that if such travel were possible, it might not affect the past we know. Instead, it might create a separate path, a new version of events, a different timeline that unfolds independently. In this view, the past is not changed, but expanded. Each interaction creates a branch, a new sequence of events that coexist with others, and this idea, often referred to in simple terms as a kind of branching reality, offers a way to soften the paradox. Because if each action creates a new path, then contradictions no longer collapse into themselves. They simply diverge. One version of events continues in one direction, another unfolds in a different way. Now, we don't need to decide which of these ideas is correct. In fact, it is better if we don't, because the purpose here is not to solve the mystery of time, but to sit with it, to feel its complexity, its quiet resistance to simple answers. There is something almost calming about this, because it reminds us that not everything needs to be resolved. Some ideas exist not to be answered, but to be explored, to expand our sense of what is possible. And perhaps this is why stories of time travel have appeared again and again across cultures, not as precise descriptions of how time works, but as reflections of how it feels, the desire to return, to change, to understand the connection between past, present, and future. And as we connect this back to everything we've explored so far, something begins to take shape. Ancient stories of journeys where time behaves differently. Modern science revealing that time is in fact flexible under certain conditions. And now the realization that moving freely through time, especially backward, introduces complexities that are not easily resolved. All of these ideas do not cancel each other out. They sit together, quietly, forming a picture that is not fully complete, but deeply intriguing. And as we move forward, this leads us gently into another question. Because if time travel, especially backward travel, is complex, uncertain, and perhaps limited, then what about those who are imagined to have mastered it? Those beings, whether described as visitors, observers, or something else, who appear in stories across time. Who are they? Where do they come from? And why in so many accounts do they seem strangely familiar? As we move gently into this next layer, the question begins to shift once more. Up until now, we've been exploring movement, distance, time, and the quiet patterns that seem to connect them. But now, we turn our attention to something more personal, something closer, the figures themselves. Because in many of the accounts, ancient and modern alike, there are not only descriptions of objects or motion, but of beings. And what is quietly striking is not how different these beings are, but how familiar they often appear. Across a wide range of reports, especially in more recent times, there is a recurring image, a form that is not entirely human, but not entirely alien either. A figure with 2 arms, 2 legs, a head positioned above a central body, eyes that are often described as large, features that are simplified, reduced, almost as if shaped by a different set of priorities. Now, it's important to approach this gently. Descriptions vary, accounts are not always consistent, and perception, as we've seen, can be influenced by expectation, memory, and interpretation. So we are not looking for exact matches, we are looking for patterns, and the pattern that emerges is subtle but persistent, a kind of resemblance, not identical, but recognizable. And this raises a quiet question. Why would beings described as coming from elsewhere, whether from the sky, from distant realms, or from beyond our understanding, so often appear somewhat like us? There are several possibilities. One is that the human mind naturally shapes the unknown into familiar forms. When we encounter something we don't understand, we interpret it through what we already know. We see faces in clouds. We imagine figures in shadows. We project human features onto the unfamiliar because it helps us make sense of it. And this is a powerful explanation. It reflects how perception works, how the mind organizes information, and in many cases it may be enough. But there is another possibility we can explore gently, not as a conclusion, but as a perspective. What if the resemblance is not only projection, but connection? What if, in some way, these forms are not entirely separate from us? Not completely different, but related. This idea may sound unusual at first, but let's approach it slowly. Because when we look at life on Earth, we notice something interesting. Despite the vast diversity of forms, plants, animals, organisms of all kinds, there are patterns that repeat, structures that appear again and again, limbs arranged in similar ways, symmetry, balance. It is as if certain designs are favoured, not by intention, but by what works, by what allows movement, perception, interaction with the environment. And over time, these patterns become common, not identical, but recognizable. Now imagine extending that idea beyond a single moment in time. Imagine evolution, not just across species, but across time itself. The gradual change of form shaped by environment, by function, by adaptation. And now, gently, imagine projecting that process forward, far beyond the present, into a distant future. What might a human being look like after many generations of change, after adapting to new environments, new conditions, perhaps even new ways of living? The answer is not certain, but we can imagine. Perhaps the body becomes more efficient, less focused on strength, more on cognition. Perhaps the features simplify. Eyes adapt to different lighting conditions, limbs become more refined, the overall form remains recognizable, but altered. Subtle changes accumulating over time. Now, again, this is not a claim. It is a thought, a way of exploring possibility. And when we place this idea alongside the recurring descriptions of certain beings, those with simplified humanoid forms, it creates a quiet resonance, not a direct connection, but a sense that the unfamiliar may not be entirely unrelated. There is another layer to this idea as well, because if we consider the possibility of movement through time, not just forward, but perhaps in more complex ways, then the distinction between other and future begins to blur. A being from another place and a being from another time may not be as different as they first appear. And this brings us to a very gentle but intriguing thought. What if some of the beings described in stories, in sightings, in moments of encounter, are not entirely separate from us? What if they are connected to us, not through space, but through time? Not visitors from distant stars, but from distant moments. Again, we move carefully. This is not a conclusion. It is a possibility, one that sits quietly alongside others, but it offers something interesting, a way of connecting several ideas we have been exploring. Movement that feels unusual, time that behaves differently, and now forms that feel both unfamiliar and familiar at the same time. There is something almost reflective about this, because it suggests that the mystery we're exploring may not be entirely external. It may not be only about what exists beyond us, but also about what we may become. And perhaps that is why these images, these descriptions feel so compelling, because they sit at the edge of recognition, close enough to feel known, distant enough to remain mysterious, and as we sit with this idea, gently, it leads us toward the next step in our journey. Because if there is even a small possibility that some of these beings are connected to us through time, then we might begin to ask a deeper question. Not just who they are, but why they would return, what purpose such a journey might serve, and whether those quiet patterns we've been following, stories, movements, encounters, are part of something more than observation, something that involves intention, something that unfolds not just across space, but across the long unfolding arc of time itself. As we move a little deeper into this quiet possibility, the question begins to turn inward. Not just what these beings might be, but why they would appear at all. Because if we allow ourselves, gently, without commitment, to consider the idea that some of these figures might be connected to us through time, then their presence becomes more than a mystery. It becomes a story with direction, with intention, with purpose. And so, we begin with something simple. If you could travel into the past, quietly, carefully, what would you do? Would you observe? Would you intervene? Would you try to change something? Or would you simply watch, knowing that even the smallest action might ripple outward in ways you cannot predict? These are not easy questions, and perhaps that is the point. Because when we imagine a future version of ourselves, one that has gained the ability to move through time, we must also imagine the responsibility that comes with it. The awareness that history is delicate, that cause and effect are intertwined, that even a small shift could lead to unexpected outcomes. And yet, when we look at the patterns we've been exploring, stories of encounters, moments of observation, brief appearances that leave an impression but do not seem to fully alter the course of events, we begin to notice something subtle, a kind of restraint, a sense that whatever is being described does not interfere too strongly. It appears, it is noticed, and then it withdraws, almost as if it is following a rule, not written, not stated, but quietly present. A kind of boundary between observation and intervention. Now, of course, this could be coincidence. It could reflect the way stories are told, how narratives tend to center on moments rather than continuous interaction. But it also invites another possibility, that if such encounters were real, whether in the past or present, they might be limited, carefully, intentionally, not to avoid discovery entirely, but to avoid disruption. There's a gentle analogy that can help us feel this idea. Imagine you're studying a delicate ecosystem, a forest, perhaps, filled with complex interactions between plants, animals, and the environment. If you enter that system, your presence changes it, even if you try to remain unnoticed. Your footsteps disturb the ground. Your movements alter the behavior of nearby creatures, and if you interfere too much, the system begins to shift in ways that are difficult to predict. So instead, you observe from a distance, you gather information, you learn, without changing what you're trying to understand. Now imagine extending that idea across time, a future observer looking back at earlier stages of human history, watching, learning, perhaps even trying to understand how certain outcomes came to be. In such a situation, intervention would not be taken lightly, because the system being observed is not just a forest, it is history itself, and history, once changed, cannot easily be restored. There is another layer to this idea as well, because if we consider the possibility that future humans might return to earlier points in time, we must also consider why. What would motivate such a journey? Curiosity is one possibility. The desire to understand origins, to witness moments that shaped the present. But there may be others, more practical, more urgent, because, as we look at our own world, we see that it is not static. It changes, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. And with change comes uncertainty, environmental shifts, technological challenges, questions about survival, sustainability, and adaptation. Now imagine projecting those challenges forward, far into the future, into a time where the consequences of earlier actions have fully unfolded. It is possible, again, gently as a thought, that future generations might look back and see points where small changes could have led to different outcomes. Moments where intervention might have prevented a problem or guided development in a new direction. Not dramatically, not in ways that rewrite everything, but in subtle ways. Adjustments, influences, small nudges rather than large disruptions. And this idea of influence rather than control feels consistent with many of the patterns we've seen. Stories of guidance, of knowledge being shared, of brief encounters that leave an impression rather than a transformation. Now, we must be careful. There is no evidence that such interventions have occurred, and many stories that suggest them can be explained through cultural, psychological, or symbolic means. But as a framework, as a way of connecting the ideas we've explored, it offers something interesting, a narrative that is not about external visitors arriving from distant places, but about continuity, about a loop, where the future and the past are connected not as separate points, but as parts of a larger whole. There is something almost poetic about this, because it suggests that the story of humanity may not be linear, not simply moving from past to future, but unfolding in a way that allows for reflection, for return, for connection across time. And perhaps that is why these ideas resonate so deeply, because they touch on something familiar, the desire to understand where we come from, the curiosity about where we are going, and the quiet hope that somehow those two directions might be linked. Not in a way that removes uncertainty, but in a way that adds depth, meaning, a sense that the present is not isolated, but part of a much larger journey. And as we move toward the final part of our exploration, we begin to gather these threads together. Stories, observations, patterns in space, patterns in time, ideas that echo across centuries, not as answers, but as reflections. And perhaps, in the end, what we are really exploring is not whether these connections are real in a physical sense, but whether they reveal something about how we see the universe and our place within it. And so, as our journey begins to slow, we find ourselves returning, not to a conclusion, but to a feeling, a quiet sense that many of the things we've explored, stories, observations, ideas, may not be separate after all, but instead, different ways of looking at the same mystery. Let's take a moment gently to gather the threads. We began with stories, ancient accounts of sky beings, flying vehicles, journeys beyond the ordinary world, stories told in different languages, shaped by different cultures, yet carrying a familiar tone. Then we noticed something subtle, that the stories were not just imaginative, but interpretive, attempts to describe something unfamiliar using the language available at the time, chariots instead of machines, creatures instead of structures, divine journeys instead of physical travel, not because the storytellers were mistaken, but because they were translating, bringing the unknown into a form that could be understood. From there, we moved outward. We saw patterns across continents, echoes of similar experiences appearing in places that had little contact with one another, Not identical stories, but resonant ones, like variations of a theme. Then we looked at the Earth itself, at locations that seemed intentional, prepared, open to the sky, not as proof of anything extraordinary, but as part of a broader pattern, a suggestion that space, like story, might hold traces of something larger. We explored maps, representations of the world that, at times, seemed to carry a perspective slightly beyond their era. Not perfectly, not conclusively, but enough to invite curiosity. Then we turn to the present, to modern observations of objects that move in ways that feel unfamiliar, not impossible, but different. Motion that seems smooth, effortless, almost disconnected from the resistance we expect. And in those descriptions we heard echoes of the past, not in detail, but in feeling, a sense that something does not quite fit, that the usual rules may not fully apply. From there, we moved into the quiet language of science, not as a final authority, but as another way of interpreting the unknown. We saw that movement can change depending on how it interacts with its environment. That distance might not always be about travelling faster, but about finding a different path. That space itself may be more flexible than it appears. And then, gently, we turn to time. Perhaps the most subtle of all. We saw that time is not perfectly uniform, that it can stretch, slow, and shift depending on motion and gravity. That under certain conditions, what feels like a short experience can correspond to a much longer passage elsewhere. And in that realization, ancient stories of time slipping began to feel less like pure imagination and more like reflections of something real, not understood in the same way, but felt. Then came the deeper questions, about moving backward through time, about paradoxes, about the delicate structure of cause and effect, and the possibility that time may not allow simple loops or changes to what has already happened. From there, we turned inward again, to the beings themselves, figures described as unfamiliar, yet strangely recognizable, forms that echo our own, and the possibility, quiet, speculative, that they may not be entirely separate from us, that they could represent something connected through time, not visitors from elsewhere, but from another moment. And finally we considered intention, the idea that if such connections exist, they may be guided not by force, but by restraint, by observation, by a careful balance between presence and non-interference, not altering the flow of history, but perhaps learning from it, or gently influencing it in ways that are difficult to see. Now, as we sit with all of this, something begins to emerge, not a conclusion, not a single answer, but a perspective, that all of these elements, myth, observation, science, speculation, may be different lenses, different ways of looking at the same underlying question. What are we seeing when we encounter something that does not fit? And perhaps more importantly, how do we interpret it? There is a quiet beauty in this, because it reminds us that understanding is not always about certainty. Sometimes it is about connection, about noticing patterns, about allowing different ideas to sit together even when they do not fully align. And in that space, between what we know and what we wonder, something meaningful begins to form, a kind of awareness that the universe may be more layered than it appears, not chaotic, not random, but complex in a way that invites exploration. And perhaps that is the most important part of all, not whether these ideas are ultimately true in a literal sense, but that they encourage us to look more carefully, to question more gently, to remain open to possibilities without becoming lost in them. Because in the end, the mystery is not something to be solved all at once. It is something to be experienced, quiet, patiently, like listening to a distant sound, and slowly realizing that it is part of a much larger symphony. And so, as we come to the end of tonight's exploration, we do not close the question. We leave it open, softly, gently, as something that can continue to unfold long after this moment has passed. And so, we've reached the end of tonight's exploration. Whether your eyes are still open or you're already floating somewhere between waking and dreaming, thank you for being part of this little journey. If you'd like to join me again for more gentle wanderings, you're always welcome to subscribe or share this with someone who could use a peaceful pause. Time has a way of slipping through our fingers, but here, in this quiet moment, it's just you and the soft hush of rest. Sleep peacefully, wherever and whenever you may be.